Chapter 4.1 Addendum 2 Theory Section. Cause is the action of bringing an effect into existence, taking an effect out of existence, knowing or not knowing. That which is brought into existence, taken out of existence, known or not known is called an effect. Thus life, in all its manifestations, is causative. Causation is the common denominator of all life impulses. Causation is achieved by postulates. A postulate is a causative consideration. A consideration is defined as a thought, or idea. Life can believe itself to be an effect, but that belief is itself a causative consideration. Responsibility is the willingness to assume causation. A being can assume causation for anything. The only liability to assuming causation is to run a being out of games. The only liability to not assuming causation is to give the being a surfeit of games. Thus, as games become progressively more compulsive, the willingness to assume causation responsibility is seen to lessen. Unwillingness to assume causation is thus a measure of the compulsiveness to play games in a being. Complementary postulates enhance affinity. Conflicting postulates lessen affinity. Thus, affinity is the willingness to create complementary postulates. Love is the expression of affinity. Reality is the degree to which complementary postulates are created. Thus, as games become progressively more compulsive, things become progressively less real to the being. Things are only as real as one is creating complementary postulates regarding them. Communication is the action of creating complementary postulates. When two or more beings adopt complementary postulates regarding a creation, they share that creation, which is now a co-creation. They are said to be in agreement regarding that creation. Thus, agreement is a shared creation. Beings, by means of their willingness to create complementary postulates, that is, affinity, and by actually creating complementary postulates, that is, communication, achieve co-creation, that is, reality. Thus understanding is achieved between beings. Games, because they contain conflicting postulates, lessen understanding between beings. A right action is a lovable action. It is an action that one is willing to create complementary postulates with. A wrong action is an unlovable action. It is an action that one is unwilling to create complementary postulates with. Thus, the concept of right and wrong is a concept brought about by games. There is no absolute right and no absolute wrong. What is considered right or wrong is relative to the being and the games he is playing. Thus, what is considered a right action in one society can be a capital offense in another. However, although the subject of what is right and what is wrong is within games, there is a senior ethic. This is the subject of the right way to play games. This ethic, being about games, is not relative to the being and the games he is playing, and is thus not within games. This ethic is the code of the ethical being. While games are played within this ethic, they retain all their element of fun, but cease to be the traps they become when played outside of this ethic. The only safe way to play games is to play them within this ethic. But the being can only play within this ethic while games are non-compulsive. Therefore he needs to address the subject of games with a view to taking the compulsion out of them. Thereafter he'll be able to play within the ethic, and enjoy games forever with no liability to his beingness. Continuing on the subject of within-game ethics. A game's rule is an agreement between beings denoting permissible, right, play. Play outside of the rules is considered improper and therefore wrongful play. Laws, are games rules denoting permissible play in a society. Thus, to accuse another of a wrong action is to accuse him of acting outside the rules of the game. It is to accuse him of unethical behavior. A being, having lost a game played fairly within the rules, can either accept the loss, or attempt to imply that the victor had committed wrongful play. These are the only two choices open to him. If he can convince his opponent that he has committed wrongful play, he, the victor, will believe that he has behaved unethically and did not win the game fairly. The action of assigning causation for wrongful, that is, unethical, play, to an opponent is called blame. If the opponent accepts the blame, he feels guilt. Not wishing to behave in an unethical manner, the guilty being resolves not to play in such a manner again. This, of course, is the precise effect intended by the blamer, who, now having succeeded in limiting his opponent's willingness to act, is more easily able to overwhelm him. Thus, blame is seen as an attempt to lower another's willingness to act, by invoking the suggestion of wrongful play, and thereby make him more easy to overwhelm. The blame/guilt mechanism is pure games play. The purpose of blame is only to permit the blamer to win games. Unable to win games any other way, and having the need to win games, he resorts to the blame mechanism in order to do so. In that any life game has a near infinite number of possibilities within it, and that it is clearly impossible to draw up games rules for all of them, the blame/guilt mechanism is always available to a games player. There is always some action he can point his finger at, declare it wrongful, and so attempt to make his opponent feel guilty, and thus use less than his full abilities in the playing of the game. As a wrong act is essentially an unlovable act, the use of the blame mechanism is pure emotional blackmail. For example, I'll withdraw my love, that is, affinity, from you, if you persist in acting in such a manner that prevents me from winning the game. However, blame has the liability of having to convince the other being that a wrongness has occurred. So the blamer has to keep the wrongness in existence in order to convince the other that this has occurred. Thus we find the blamer having to keep whole sections of his mind in existence in order to convince others that he has been wronged. It is a terrible price to pay for his compulsion to win games, but it clearly shows the limits to which beings will go in order to do so. The blame/guilt mechanism breeds compulsive games play. Compulsive games play breeds the blame/guilt mechanism. They are inseparable, and where you find one you will always find the other. By means of the blame/guilt mechanism, life finally degenerates into a frantic attempt to make others guilty while equally frantically resisting their attempts to do the same thing to you. At this level, life is seen by the player as one vast sea of wrongness, containing one tiny island of rightness, himself. And he knows above all things that if he stops assigning wrongness, that is, blame, for even one instant, his island will sink, and he will drown and be lost forever in that sea of wrongness. It's not that the compulsive blamer is always right, it's just that he has a vast need to be right. He is always right. Even when he is wrong, he is right. And he'll still be protesting his rightness when the coffin lid is nailed down on him. For he knows how to win games, always make sure that self is right and others are wrong. It becomes his epitaph. This is how the subject of right and wrong got into games play. And games have never been the same since. It has no other significance. Once it is understood for what it is, it will be found to resolve with no other address than by use of the exercises in the practical section. As the compulsion to play games lessens, the need to invoke the blame/guilt mechanism also lessens, and finally vanishes. It always was a crummy mechanism, and games are much more fun and healthy without it. Shame is guilt exposed. Ridicule is the exposure of guilt. Shame/ridicule form a pair like blame/guilt, from which they were spawned. All of freedom lies within the concept of freedom of choice. When one is no longer free to choose, one has lost all the freedom there is. The basic freedom of choice is between making and not making a postulate. In life this translates into the freedom of choice to play or not play a game. Thus, to the degree that the playing of games becomes compulsive, freedom becomes lost. All entrapment is to be found in the compulsive playing of games. The route from entrapment to freedom, then, lies in the regaining of one's freedom of choice, to play or not play games. As the being got himself into this trap, then only the being can get himself out of this trap. One being can show another the route out, but the trapped being must walk this route out himself. Thus, one being cannot free another, he can only help him to free himself. You will never find freedom over that way. No matter how thoroughly you ransack this universe in search of freedom, you will only discover more and more traps. Indeed, the search for freedom over that way is one of the basic traps of the universe. You can say to another being, "Free me," and with the best intent in the world he will only succeed in making you into his slave. The very best he can do for you is to show you the nature of life and games, and indicate the route out of the trap. The rest is up to you. This is the basic truth about freedom. Outside of this truth lie the freedom games, games which cash in on the desire of every compulsive games player to be free. We always tend to imagine a slave master as a rather muscular man armed with a large whip. Such a man is not even a novice at the gentle art of making slaves, for all the very best slaves are voluntary slaves, and would not give up their slavery for anything. They are convinced that they are on the road to freedom, and need no whips to keep them on it. To trap you while promising to free you is probably the oldest game in this universe. This is the game of the freedom maker. He makes slaves out of those who walk a road to freedom that he has created for them. All the very best traps in this universe are clearly marked, the road to freedom. The game of the freedom maker is big business in this universe, and always has been, simply because the willing slave, deluded into walking the road to freedom, is always more than happy to work long hours for next to no pay, and so create enormous wealth for the slave master. The places where his willing slaves toil on their road to freedom are called freedom factories. This is a slang term. The universe is strewn with them. Whole planets have become vast freedom factories. Very probably the first extraterrestrial visitor to this planet will be an agent from a local freedom factory, scouting the territory to see if it's worthwhile setting up shop here. The whole technique of the freedom maker is to suspend a carrot called freedom in front of the person's nose. The carrot is on a string joined to a stick, the other end of which is attached to the person's back. Once the device is in place, the person will follow the carrot forever, down the road to freedom, created by the freedom maker. Freedom is the only thing that a being will permit himself to be put into slavery for. Ponder these words as you ransack this universe in search of freedom, for the gates of the freedom factories are always open, and a new slave is always made most welcome while the carrot is being suspended in front of his nose. The subject of freedom has always been bigger business in this universe than the subject of power. This is because the carrot of freedom is always considered a more valuable carrot than the carrot of power. It has been said that a man will sell his soul in exchange for power. What then is he willing to sell in exchange for promised freedom from the compulsion to be powerful? Why, his freedom, of course. It is the only thing he has to offer in exchange for such a prized goal. Hence the game of the freedom maker and freedom factories. Reasons why for a postulate always come later than the postulate for which they are created, as the reasons why. The postulate always comes later than the desire to make that postulate. The sequence is always desire, postulate, reasons why for the postulate. The reasons why for a postulate are only justifications to convince others that the postulate is reasonable. Thus, reasons why are only created in order to justify a postulate, and always come later in time than the postulate. The postulate, in turn, is always later than the desire to achieve the effect which the postulate puts into action. The closest you can ever come to a reason why for a postulate is that it seemed like a good idea at the time. Now this is not something dreamed up by me after a heavy night reading Alice in Wonderland. It happens to be the truth of the matter. Something I believe the gifted mathematician who wrote Alice suspected too. The fact that the mere suggestion we function in such a manner sends those with a mechanistic view of the mind crawling up their own synapses is only indicative of how little they know about the mind, and how trapped they are within the whole subject of reasons why and conviction in general. Now it is true that a being, feeling unable to dream up convincing reasons why to justify a postulate, will not make that postulate. But these are reasons why for not making a postulate, not reasons why for make a postulate. The truth is that a being never needs a reason why for making a postulate until he has made that postulate, and needs convincing reasons to justify it to others. His postulates stem from his desires stem from his urge to be alive and in there playing the game. It's easy to see how the general belief that the reasons why for a postulate preceded the making of the postulate came about. The being, having made a postulate and now having to dream up convincing reasons why he made that postulate in order to make the postulate appear reasonable to others, will always swear on his stack of Bibles that his reasons for making the postulate existed prior to the making of the postulate. For to admit otherwise is to open him up to the charge that he's making postulates without due reason why, and then justifying them afterwards. The only way he can defend his postulate as being reasonable is to swear that the reasons for making the postulate existed prior to the making of the postulate. Eventually he comes to believe his own lie, and becomes trapped in a web of reason. If a being ever needed a reason why to make a postulate, then the first postulate ever made in the universe could never have been made, for at the time it was made no reasons why for postulates existed. That first postulate could only have been made from a desire to achieve a certain state of affairs. That is the way it was then, and that is the way it has been ever since. First came the desire, then the postulate, and only later were reasons why invented to justify the postulate and make it convincing to others. See reasons why as pure and simple conviction phenomena, and you have the entire flavor of all this. The mind, then, is full of convincing reasons why one should not make postulates, but it contains no reasons why a postulate has been made. Of course, one can always point to some part of the mind and assign it as the reason why one has a compulsion to kick cats, say, but this assigning is coming later than the postulate to kick cats. If you wish to be free of your compulsion to kick cats, you need to address this postulate to kick cats, and the whole subject of cats and kicking. There is clearly a compulsive games condition here between you and cats. Ransacking your mind and assigning reasons why to your compulsion to kick cats will not help you in the slightest. Any person can sit down and invent an infinity of convincing reasons why they have to kick cats. It's a very interesting intellectual exercise, and can give insight into the whole subject of justification and reasons why in general, but don't expect it to do anything about your compulsion to kick cats. That can only be resolved by resolving your compulsion to play games with cats. The mind, then, is only resolved by addressing postulates, and the subject of games, postulates in conflict. Reasons why for the postulates always come later than the postulates, and so have no part in the resolution of the postulates in conflict. When you fully grasp this, you will stop ransacking your mind in a futile attempt to discover the reasons why for your current mental state. For the only reasons why you will discover there are the ones you are putting there now, and they are all later than the event. It's futile searching a stable for a horse that is gone. But it's bordering on the ridiculous to search a stable for a horse that was never there, and then convince yourself that the piece of straw you find is really the horse. It is only ignorance of the truth of this matter that causes patients to spend years with psychotherapists in search of the reasons why for their troubles, and why psychotherapists waste their own and their patients' time in such a futile search. The only justification for the activity is that it's profitable for the therapist, and the patient always lives in hopes that he might one day get somewhere. Whole schools of psychotherapy have grown up professing to know the real reasons why of behavior, and they vie with each other to see who can be the most convincing. As it's possible to invent an infinity of convincing reasons why for any facet of the mind, this activity has unlimited prospects for future games play, but bleak prospects for helping people to resolve their compulsion to play games. Once you grasp the truth about this subject of postulates and reasons why, you will also learn to cut through the smoke screen of reasons why that others throw up to justify their postulates, and be able to see their naked desire and postulates clearly exposed. The brush salesman may give you 1,000 convincing reasons why you ought to buy his brush, but all of them come later than the fact that he desires to sell a brush to you. Life gets very simple once you realize that the correct sequence is desire, postulate, reasons why, invented for postulate. The subject of reasons why gets combined with the blame/guilt mechanism. Thus, a person may search their mind for the reason why of some unwanted mental condition. Having assigned a reason why that is convincing to them, they promptly blame it for the unwanted mental condition. This is compounding the lie, and only traps them further in the blame/guilt mechanism, and in the whole subject of conviction and justification. The unwanted mental condition is essentially a postulate, which is held in place by the compulsive games condition with its opposition postulate within the goals package. Only when addressed in this context will the unwanted mental condition resolve. Some modern schools of psychotherapy are what is known as evaluative schools. The practitioner of their type of school does not search in the mind of his patient for the reasons why of the patient's difficulties, for he has already convinced himself that he knows the real reason why for Everion's difficulties. Therapy, if it can be called such, with this type of practitioner is not a matter of searching for anything, it is purely a matter of the practitioner convincing the patient of the practitioner's beliefs. As some of these beliefs seem very strange to their patients, and to most other people, come to that, it can take years to convince them. All the difficulties in convincing are ascribed to the patient's resistance to accepting the truth. Even after conviction has been achieved, the patient still has his unwanted condition, but he now also possesses a thoroughly convincing argument as to why he has that condition. These schools have come a long way from the definition of a workable psychotherapy, one that can vanish unwanted mental conditions. I suppose the acquisition of a set of convincing reasons why one has a mental condition is an improvement upon not having such a set, but it's a very poor substitute for being free of the unwanted mental condition. If one were to inquire into the nature of the quality or ability that is closest to life itself, one would eventually arrive at the subject of knowing. Life can know. All else is the subject of methods or systems of knowing. The basic law, or agreement, of this universe is that one will only know that which is brought into existence to be known. Thus, this universe sets a limitation upon knowing as only being possible for the class of things which are brought into existence to be known. This law is peculiar to this universe. A being can only operate, that is, play games within this universe while in agreement with this law. Once he starts to know outside of this law, he is operating outside the universe. The action of bringing something into existence so that it can be known is called creation. Thus, in this universe, knowing is limited to those things which have been created in the universe. It should never be considered that knowing is by nature limited to those things which are created to be known. Life can know. It can know anything, whether it has been brought into existence to be known or not. In order to operate in this universe, life considers, or agrees, that it will not know until something is brought into existence to be known. This limitation upon knowing is the basic law, and the only basic law, that governs this universe. Other universes can be constructed upon other basic laws, but they would all be some type of limitation of knowing. For while knowing is unlimited, any type of universe or game is impossible. Bear the basic law of this universe in mind as you do the practical exercises, for all the games you have ever become trapped in this universe have been based upon the basic law of the universe. Purpose, intention, goal and postulate can be regarded as synonyms. A game is a contest in conviction. Conviction, then, is an enforcement of knowingness. Enforcement of knowingness is called importance. Purposes are made more intense in order to make them more convincing. Thus, importance is the intensity of purpose, the degree of mustness in that purpose. As the intensity, or importance, of a purpose approaches zero, so the purpose itself approaches zero. Important bears the same relation to purpose as cattishness does to a cat. When all the cattishness has been removed, the cat has gone too. Thus, to resolve a purpose in the mind, it is only necessary to address the importance of this purpose. Once this has been resolved, the purpose itself will approach zero and finally vanish. This is the basis of all effective psychotherapy. Significance is the consideration of both the nature of a purpose and its importance. So significance too approaches zero as the intensity, or importance, of that purpose approaches zero. There can be no significance in the absence of importance. Thus, importance is the basis of all significance. So any purpose, to stay in existence, requires an importance rating. But importance is an enforced knowingness, and once the importance has gone, the purpose too has vanished. Thus, all purposes are systems or methods of knowing, not knowing, making known, or making not known. Purposes are held in suspension in the mind by opposing purposes. Thus, a purpose can only be resolved in relation to its opposition. It can never be resolved in isolation. A pair of purposes in opposition is called a problem. Problems are the basic building blocks of games. it is necessary to clearly differentiate between the rather loose term opposite and the very precise term opposition. Opposition is the exact opposing postulate, whereas opposite has a much broader use. For example, the opposite of knowing is loosely regarded as not knowing. However, the opposition postulate to know is to be not known. This is not a matter of conjecture, but of logical necessity. Life has four basic abilities. Every purpose in life must manifest in line with one or other of these basic abilities. The totality of these manifestations regarding a purpose we call the goals package of the purpose. Thus, all possible manifestations of the goal to know are within the to know goals package. Thus, all possible games regarding a purpose are within its goals package. Thus all possible non-games, complementary postulate situations regarding a purpose are within its goals package. Thus, the totality of charge upset on any goal is to be found within its package. It is a fundamental error in psychotherapy to go outside a goals package looking for charge that is within the package. It is always within the package. There is no other place it can be. For example, a man has a compulsion to drink. The totality of this problem, and all other possible problems on the subject of drinking, are within the to-drink goals package. To go searching outside that to-drink goals package for the reasons why of his compulsion to drink is to court failure. Yet some schools of psychotherapy maintain that the man's compulsion to drink, and everything else about him, apparently, is to do with his infantile sex life. His sex life, both infantile and non-infantile, is within the to-sex package. His drinking life is within the to-drink package. They are separate packages, and it's a fundamental error to address one in an effort to resolve the other. It's analogous to a medical doctor bandaging up a man's toe when he has a cut finger. It may be necessary for some psychotherapists to resolve their own to-sex packages before they will be able to appreciate this simple truth. If so, then so be it. Due to the nature of conviction and enforced knowingness, the basic goals package is to know. All other goals packages are within this package. All other goals are methods of knowing, not knowing, making known or making not known. This truth can also be arrived at by examining the purpose of any purpose. Eventually you will arrive back at one or other of the legs of the to know package. Once there, you can backtrack no further, for the purpose of each of these purposes is its own purpose. All goals packages are in exactly the same form as the to know package. All goals packages are addressed in exactly the same manner as the to know package. A goal can be general or specific. For example, to grow is general. To grow petunias is specific. To grow petunias in the springtime is even more specific. All specific versions of a goal are within the general version. Hence, only the general form of a goal is ever addressed, for all possible specifics are within the general.